will help us a little bit and inspire us and remind us that some conflict, as we discussed last time, can be constructive. And it's important to harness the power of positive conflict, constructive conflict, and disagreement. We don't want uniformity, after all. We just want to remember how to do it well. Ari asked me to share some art in each session. So really briefly, this is a piece of art I created many years ago. It's based on a Hebrew illuminated manuscript image from the Passover Seder Haggadah of sages, or perhaps a family, but it really looks like rabbis, the medieval French or Italian hats. The headwear gives it away that they're probably rabbis. One of their students is waiting on them, and they're discussing the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and perhaps they're arguing. And this is a drawing. Because I was using a Hebrew illuminated manuscript as the inspiration, I wanted to use materials that can be found in any home office as a sort of contrast to the epic and revered tradition of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. So this is a drawing, or a painting really, because I blended colors, but it's made with Sharpies on Scotch tape on glass. That's what this drawing is made from, because I wanted to use very, very ubiquitous, everyday materials for it. And it really captures the idea of discussion, disagreement, which is at the center of our study today. So here's the thing, though. Remember that we come from a tradition that celebrates disagreement and also has a place in it for disagreement beyond the human conversation, beyond the horizontal. We have, in Jewish tradition, we have the concept of arguing with God. Part of what we have to explore is how that shows up in various rabbinic texts. But by way of introduction, briefly, I want to remind us of a biblical text, just to begin. The topic for today is divine intervention in human conflict. And I told Ari that I really changed the topic an hour ago because I got excited about this other direction. So we'll see how it goes. But let's remember that in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, God says, in the presence of Abraham, shall I hide what I'm about to do? I'm about to destroy the wicked land of Sodom, where they are so cruel, especially to visitors. According to the legends, if someone would visit the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, and would look for a place to stay overnight, they would offer the person a bed. And if the person were too short for the bed, they would stretch him out to fit the bed. And if the person were too tall for the bed, they would chop off his feet to make him fit the bed in the guest house. This is an image I remember from my childhood. I remember learning about this in my first or second grade. And it's a disturbing image of radical conformity and cruelty to the stranger. And Sodom was known as a very cruel place. God decided to destroy it, and yet God chooses to reveal this to Abraham. And this is one of my favorite moments in the Bible, because look carefully. Now the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the world will be blessed by him or through him? I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity, his generations, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord, God is speaking here, in order that I may bring about for Abraham what the Lord has promised him. And the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, their sin is so grave, I'm going to descend and see, have they acted according to the cry that I'm hearing? The cries of the victims, the cries of the oppressed. Is it really true that things are so terrible down there? And if not, I will know. If they're actually innocent, I will know. Otherwise, I will destroy them. That's the implication. Otherwise, I will destroy them. The men, these are the three men who visited Abraham. According to tradition, they're angels, they're messengers, angelic messengers. And they leave now. They leave to go to Sodom, and they're going to destroy Sodom. Abraham came forward and said, Ha'af tispeh tzadik im rasha? Will you destroy the innocent along with the guilty? And this is the famous scene in which Abraham argues or haggles with God on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah and says, God, you can't commit an injustice. You're God. You're supposed to be the God of justice. How can you commit an injustice? If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you spare the city? And God says, yes. And Abraham says, and if there are 5 people missing from the 50, will you destroy the city because of 5 people missing? Meaning, if there are only 45 righteous people, and God says, no, it's okay, 45, I'll let them live. And Abraham goes down to 40, 35, 30, all the way down to 10. In the end, there are not 10 righteous people, and the city is destroyed. But we have this very strange snapshot of an argument by a human being on behalf of other human beings, in this case, wicked, oppressive human beings, which is a very important detail of the story. Abraham is arguing with God on behalf of, in order to save, wicked people. Even on behalf of the wicked, even on behalf of the oppressed, perhaps there are righteous people among them. Maybe there's a crowd of people who are doing something wrong, but there are righteous people among them. And we have to consider those righteous people. If there are enough of them, if there are 10 of them, then they constitute a sub-community in that larger community. And maybe we have to take that seriously. That's one of the lessons perhaps of this moment. But what I love about this moment is that you read this and you ask a very simple question. Who is God speaking to? When God says, will I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And if you read carefully, if you read this in context, if you read the verses before and after, it seems pretty clear that God is not addressing these words to anyone in particular. God is speaking out loud in order to be overheard by Abraham, so that Abraham will come forward and argue with God. It's an invitation. And it's almost as if, the way I picture this scene, God is speaking earlier to the angels and to Abraham, and then God turns to the camera and breaks the fourth wall and speaks to us, the readers, and says, will I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then Abraham overhears these words and comes forward to argue. This is the biblical invitation, and perhaps the source of the Jewish value, which appears in many, many later texts, of arguing with God on behalf of humanity. And it's a tradition that we see. We find later in the Bible, we find that Moses does the same thing. Job argues with God. We find it throughout Jewish history. We find it in the Hasidic masters. If you're in the Hasidic class yesterday, we briefly explored the life of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and I spoke about how he argued with God on Yom Kippur on behalf of the Jewish people. And this is a very powerful tradition that has its really apotheosis in Auschwitz. We've talked about this in another class. When Elie Wiesel was there, he saw 3 rabbis put God on trial and find God guilty of allowing the Holocaust to happen to the Jewish people. And they deliberated, and they brought witnesses for the defense and witnesses for the prosecution, and they found God guilty, and the rabbi stood up to declare God guilty. And then, if you remember the end of the story, the rabbi said, God is guilty, now it's time to pray the evening prayer. Which means, and this is the lesson that Professor Wiesel taught us, you can argue with God from within the tradition. You can ask the hardest questions, you can even judge God from within the tradition, you can stay within the tradition, you can pray the evening prayer. That complexity, as an aside, was shocking and liberating to many Christian ministry students in Elie Wiesel's classroom at Boston University. It was the first time that Christian students saw the idea that you can argue with God. There's a tradition of arguing with God. But we have to go deeper into this idea because it's not a simple one. And as we go, as always, please record your questions and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So back to the sources. we're going to see three texts from the Talmud that render this concept of conflict among human beings and between human beings and God or the divine very complex. And we have to think about the relationship between these three examples we're going to see. The first one, in the first one, the divine voice is accepted. And this is a tale from the Talmud, from Tractate Eruvin, which deals with the laws of boundaries and community building. How do you create a community for the Sabbath so that you can carry from one area to another on the Sabbath? And in the midst of the early part of this tractate dealing with those matters, we have this story on the 13th page of the, actually on the 12th page of the tractate, because remember that the Talmud begins on page 2. There's no page 1 of Talmud. So if you open Talmud to study from the beginning, the first page has a letter bet on the top, which is the letter B, the second letter of the alphabet. There's no first page of Talmud. Think about why that might be. And so here we are on page 13, which is the 12th page of the Talmud. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, Rabbi Abba said in the name of his teacher Shmuel, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, literally the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, were two groups of sages in the early Mishnaic period, the early period of what we call the rabbinic era. Shammai and Hillel themselves were great sages. You've probably heard quotes from Hillel. Both of them shaped the rabbinic tradition and Jewish tradition as we know it, but there could not have been two more different people in personality and in ideology and in approach. Hillel was known for his love and kindness and compassion. Shammai was known for his rigor and his severity, and they disagreed about almost everything. And Rabbi Abba is telling us in the name of his teacher Shmuel, several generations later, that for 3 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed. The schools disagreed en masse. They had a collective disagreement. These said, the halacha, the law, is according to our opinion, and the others said the halacha is according to our opinion. Now, unlike most Talmudic discussions, we don't actually know what the dispute was about. Usually we know exactly what the dispute was about. The Talmud will tell us. Here it's a generic dispute. It just tells us the law is like us. No, the law is like us, but it doesn't tell us what are we talking about. Are we talking about the laws of kosher food or Shabbat or something else? We don't know. And after 3 years of disagreement, and we might wonder, what else were they doing during these 3 years? Didn't they have other things to do than argue for 3 years? But they were so dedicated to the search for truth or the argument itself. After 3 years, a divine voice emerged from the heavens and proclaimed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. However, the law is according to the opinion of Beit Hillel. So listen to this carefully. These and those are the words of the living God. You're right, and you're also right. And the law is like one of you. The law is like Beit Hillel. So the Talmud asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the law established according to their opinion? And the answer is, not because their arguments were better, not because their position was more true. The halacha followed their opinion because they were more agreeable and forbearing. And they showed restraint when they were affronted. And when they taught the law, they would teach their own statements and the statements of their opponents, Beit Shammai. And not only that, when they quoted their own opinion and their opinion of their opponents, they quoted their opponent's opinion first. They gave pride of place to their opponent. So first of all, just think about on a practical level what conflict might look like if we had regard and that level of respect for our interlocutors, our opponents. And if we quoted their positions assuming that they were positions that are worthy of such respect, if we quoted them first, and if we treated them with agreeableness and kind of openness, Beit Hillel did that. Beit Shammai didn't do that as much. Beit Shammai were more strict and severe, maybe more competitive, and therefore the law didn't follow them. Very interesting. Sometimes we say that the person who's more competitive, fierce, aggressive, willing to fight is going to win the battle. This is a cliche in many movies, right? The person who fights more, harder, doesn't give up. But here, the law actually follows the person who is kinder, the person who's more respectful. And that's very typically rabbinic and very typically Jewish in a certain way. But of course, what's shocking about this story, I glossed it over, I read it as if it were matter of fact, but what's really shocking about this story is that these rabbis are disagreeing. You've got a legal dispute. Imagine in the Supreme Court, there's a significant dispute that's going to affect the future of this nation. And suddenly a voice comes out of heaven and says, "You're both right. And the law is like you and not you." So first of all, the fact that a divine voice is coming out at all is shocking. And this is the end of the story. So the divine voice seems to be accepted here. That's why this is the first source we're seeing, a case in which a divine voice appears and is accepted. Given what we've already seen about Abraham arguing with God, we cannot take for granted that the divine voice will be accepted. Our next story, in fact, will challenge the idea that we take divine voices into account at all in our legal disputes. But it's shocking that a divine voice appears. From a traditional Jewish perspective, there was a thing called prophecy. There were prophets who had access to the divine spirit, who could tell the future or who could tell the truth about a situation from a divine perspective, from Moses on. And there were men and women who were prophets in our tradition. But according to the same traditional narrative, the era of prophecy had ended well before the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, well before this story. In fact, the time of prophecy really ended exactly during the time of the Purim story. The holiday of Purim is coming up not too far from now, about a month and a half from today. And we'll celebrate the holiday of Purim. Purim, among other things, is the story of the end of the era of prophecy, or the biblical era, and the beginning of the era of the rabbis, the sages, who rather than turning to divine inspiration or some kind of Holy Spirit to determine the truth, instead use logic and use argumentation and use human intellectual rigorous analysis and interpretation and argument and conflict and controversy to seek the truth. And that is very clearly emphasized among the rabbis. We're not prophets. We don't rely on prophecy. We're going to see that in a moment. We use our minds to figure things out. This is an era in which human endeavor is what matters. And here we have the divine voice telling them the answer. That's number one. That's surprise number one in this story. And number two, again, is the paradox. You're right and you're right. You're both right. You're both expressing the words of the living God. Neither of you is lying. Neither of you is misrepresenting. Neither of your words are divorced from the words of the living God, the source and truth, the truth of the truth, the ultimate truth. You're both connected to that ultimate truth. You're both expressions of that ultimate truth. But you know what? We have to decide on a practical level what to do. We can't leave it there. We have to figure out, well, okay, so which one are we going to do? Again, we don't know what they're arguing about, so we can fill in an example. Is the food kosher? Is the food not kosher? We have to know. We have to develop a communal norm, a practical decision in order to move forward. So the divine voice says both. Both of you are true, but only one of you is right. Think about that for a moment. Both of you are true, only one of you is right. Or both of you are authentic, but only one of you will shape the future, the communal policy. But the divine voice is accepted here. In our next story, the divine voice is rejected. And this is a famous story you may have seen, the famous story of the oven of Achnai. This is the oven of Achnai. It's from a different section of the Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia, which means the middle gate. the middle gate of the Talmud, which deals with the laws of damages. And in the middle, on page 59, we have the story of the oven of Achnai. What is Achnai? Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, by the way, very interesting, and I never noticed it until this second. Shmuel is the same person who told us the other story. Remember? Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel, the story we just saw. And this story also is in the name of Shmuel. That's very interesting. So the oven of Achnai, what is Achnai? Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, they surrounded this oven. There was a certain kind of oven that the rabbis were debating about, arguing about. They surrounded it with words like a snake, like an Achnai snake, which is a kind of snake. In Aramaic, that's one of the words for a certain kind of snake, and declared the oven impure. Now, we're talking about the laws of purity and impurity, which are pretty foreign to us in a modern context, but in the time of the temple and earlier, purity and impurity laws mattered a lot. Because if you wanted to go on vacation to Jerusalem and visit the Temple Mount, you had to be in a state of ritual purity. There are other implications as well. So people 2,000 years ago had a very precise sense of their own status and the status of food and other items in their lives. And there are laws about purity and impurity that have to do with objects. And in the midst of all of this, you had a technological innovation where somebody invented, to my knowledge, the first portable oven, the first kind of camping stove. And it was an oven that was designed in rings so that you could stack the rings together and then put a very light coat of pitch over it to create an oven. You could use the oven, and when you were done and it cooled off, you could disassemble it again. So 2,000 years ago, they rolled this out at Home Depot or whatever, and people were really excited. It's a portable oven. We've never had such a thing before. Very cool. But we don't have a law for it. We don't know what the status is of an oven like this. Is it pure or impure? Under certain circumstances, we have all the laws we need and all the knowledge we need about regular ovens. But what about this new 2.0 oven? So we don't know. And what happened here is the rabbis debated and debated, and they declared the oven impure. But on that day, one of the great sages, one of the greatest sages of the Mishnah of the early rabbinic period, Rabbi Eliezer, answered all the answers on earth, meaning he made all the arguments that he could possibly make to disagree with the sages, to disagree with the majority of sages, and they didn't accept his position. He was making great arguments. He was quoting all the sources. He had encyclopedic knowledge. He was quoting biblical and rabbinic sources, legal sources. He knew his stuff. He was making strong arguments, but the majority of his fellows, the other rabbis, would not accept his position. So then he did something shocking and radical. He said, if the law is like me, let the carob tree prove it. The carob tree, there was a carob tree growing there, right where they were studying. The carob tree was uprooted from its place and moved 100 amot. An amma is a Jewish measurement from the tip of the finger to the elbow, about this long. Obviously, that's going to be different for different people. But Jewish measurements, biblical and rabbinic measurements, are very organic. They're all body-based. They're not like metric. So this is an amma, 100 of these. The tree moved. Some say 400 amot it moved. And the rabbi said, we don't listen to a carob tree. We don't bring proofs from a carob tree. We're studying together. We have an agreed upon methodology of disagreement. You're supposed to use the laws and the methods that we've always used for disagreeing and for determining the truth. We don't bring proof from a carob tree. So then Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law is like me, let the water channel prove it. And the water channel, the river, flowed in the opposite direction. It flowed backwards. And they said, we don't bring proof from a channel of water, a body of water. That's not the methodology, the legal methodology that we've agreed to. And then he went and said, if the law is like me, if the law agrees with my position, let the walls of the house of study prove it. And the walls of the house of study began to fall inward. Rabbi Yoshua, who was Rabbi Eliezer's friend and opponent very often, his opposite number, his study partner, protested at the walls. And he stood up and he said, if scholars are defeating each other in the law, what does it have to do with you? And so the walls didn't fall because of the honor of Rabbi Yehoshua, who was saying, this is none of your business. But they also didn't straighten up because of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and the walls are still inclining to this day. They're still tilted to this day. And if we knew where the study house was, we could find it. We'd see a study house with leaning walls like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The walls were trapped in a very difficult position. They didn't want to insult either of the two rabbis, the one who was saying stand up again, the one who was saying fall down. So they stayed in the middle. A good solution, a good compromise by the walls. But the bottom line was the rabbis following Rabbi Yehoshua said, we don't decide the law based on walls. So then Rabbi Eliezer went and said, if the law is like me, they will prove it from heaven. And a heavenly voice came out. Have we seen a heavenly voice before? In the previous story, we heard a heavenly voice. Here again, a heavenly voice came out and said, what do you want with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is like him in every place. He's always right. Rabbi Eliezer is always right. He's the greatest of the sages. In heaven, we know that Rabbi Eliezer is right. So why are you arguing with him? Why don't you accept his position? He's making good arguments. Listen to him. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, quoting Deuteronomy, the Torah is not in heaven. Lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. What does that mean? The Torah is not in heaven. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, Rabbi Yirmiyah is now explaining Rabbi Yehoshua, the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And we do not pay attention even to a heavenly voice. Since you God already wrote at Sinai in the Torah, we follow the majority to decide the law. Achrei rabim lehatot, we follow the majority to decide the law. That's what Rabbi Yehoshua did. He stood up and said, God, I'm sorry, but this is none of your business. A voice from heaven, you already told us we're not supposed to listen to voices from heaven. You gave the Torah to us. The Torah is in human hands. The Torah belongs to people with minds to wrestle with it, to argue about it. Maybe sometimes even to get it wrong, but you gave it to us to figure out it's not yours anymore. It's our Torah. It's our tradition. We own it because you gave it to us. And you told us the methodology that we should use, which is to follow the majority. We follow the majority rule. In a postscript to the story, a generation or so later, Rabbi Natan met the prophet Elijah. The prophet Elijah appears throughout Talmudic literature as a messenger, a visitor, a stranger. Rabbi Natan met the prophet Elijah, and of course Elijah in the Bible was a prophet who at the end of his life was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. And according to legend, he goes back and forth between heaven and earth. He's privy to the secrets of heaven, but you might meet him on a lonely road one day. You might see a stranger, a hungry person, a homeless person, who's actually Elijah. Rabbi Natan met the prophet Elijah and said to him, when Rabbi Yehoshua stood up and said, the Torah is not in heaven, when Rabbi Yehoshua said, God, this is not for you, this is not your conversation, what did God do at that moment? What was happening in heaven at that very moment, Elijah? And Elijah says to him, God smiled and said, Nitzchuni banai, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me, like a father who is defeated at chess for the first time by his child and is so proud. That's what God said. God was so proud and so tickled that God's children had reached the point of maturity to be able to say, God, this has nothing to do with you. We've got this. This is our responsibility. Your voice doesn't really play a role here. The divine voice here is rejected. So there's an open question. about the relationship between these two stories that we've seen so far. Why in the first story is the divine voice accepted? And why in the second story is the divine voice rejected? And there are several answers we might give. The simplest one is that the first story we explored took place several generations before the second story. And so this might be a historical narrative that's telling us that there was a moment of evolution, there was a moment of maturation here between the first story and a couple of generations later, the second story. And this is the point where we, meaning the rabbis representing us, the sages, really took ownership of the tradition and finally accepted that the era of prophecy is over. Voices from heaven are not going to determine our reality anymore, and we bear full responsibility for the law and the future of the Jewish people. That's a simple answer. We can go with that for now, but think about the question, are there other differences between these two stories? There are other differences we might think about. Okay, so we've seen the divine voice is accepted, the divine voice is rejected, and God is happy about it. And now we have one more story to explore. And this is a story, one of my favorite Talmudic stories, in which it's not about the divine voice coming to earth, it's about the human voice. And this is in the same tractate of the Talmud, Bava Metzia, the Middle Gate, the same tractate we just saw, but 30 or so pages later. And this is a story about one of the great sages of the later period of Jewish history, not the period of the Mishnah, not the first centuries of the Common Era in which the oral tradition was gathered, collated, written down. That's the period we call the period of the Mishnah. This is now the period of the Talmud itself, which is the period of the rabbis later on from the 4th century to the 7th century or so in Babylonia, part of that time in Israel, who are now unpacking the Mishnah and arguing, continuing to argue and explore and seek the truth together. Rabbi Bar Nachmani is one of the early sages of this next period of Jewish history. So we're talking I think four generations later than the previous story that we just saw, depending on how you count. And at this point in time, the sages of Babylonia, where this story takes place, are living on sufferance of the government. So they're not actively persecuted, but they keep getting in trouble around all kinds of issues of taxes and other things because the Jewish people in Babylonia had jobs, they had farms, they worked the land or had other sources of income, and they paid their taxes like good citizens do. But twice a year there was a tradition that all the Jews would come together for study for a month. So everyone had like a mini sabbatical twice a year to come together at the great academies in Babylonia to study Torah. And this is a way of making sure that as a community we stayed connected to each other and we stayed connected to our tradition. It was the original 1-month scholar program. And it was one in the fall and one in the spring. And the problem was, this is a very beautiful thing, the problem was that for that month, those 2 months, most of the Jewish people, at least the men, stopped working and lived on the work they had done before. They saved up, but they weren't producing more, and therefore they weren't paying taxes. So Rabbi Bar Nachmani, it says rabbi, but it should be Rabbah. His name was Rabbi Bar Nachmani, was accused by the government of stealing taxes from the government because he was the great rabbi, one of the great rabbis who was inviting and gathering all the Jews to come and learn. He was like the scholar or the organizer. He was the Ari Katz of this story. And all the people who were coming for a month to learn full time with him were no longer producing taxes. So he was accused of stealing taxes and he ran away. Rabbi Bar Nachmani ran away. He went to hide in a swamp to flee from the tax collector. And he was sitting on the stump of a palm tree and studying Torah by himself. Now at this moment, the very moment that Rabbi Bar Nachmani is sitting on a stump, fleeing from the tax collector and the government persecution, and he's studying Torah, At this moment, the Talmud tells us, in the heavenly academy, there was a disagreement with regard to the law of leprosy. The law of leprosy, again, not a very relevant category for us today, but in the biblical era and even later was a very important category. And in general, there are all kinds of detailed laws about the law about leprosy, what constitutes leprosy. It's not the same thing as Hansen's disease, which is a modern affliction, sometimes called leprosy. This is a purely physical manifestation of a purely spiritual issue, and it's not something that we actually have anymore in our life today, according to the rabbis themselves. But in the biblical era, there was a thing called leprosy, and the basic law is that if a spot of skin that's pure white, snow white, appears on a person, and then a white hair grows there, the person is ritually impure. If the white hair comes first, the person is pure. So we're not going to get into all those laws of leprosy, but in heaven, they were debating a case in which we don't know which one came first. I'll say that again, because I want you to get the humor or the irony or the shock value of this statement. In heaven, and we're going to see God is involved in this debate, they're debating a case where we don't know which one came first. So number one, in heaven, they're debating. That's already a shocking, amazing thing. What do they do in heaven? They hang out and they have arguments, just like in the academies, right? That's the Jewish heaven. Jewish heaven is not all you can eat. You know, the Jewish heaven is all you can argue and all you can study and all you can debate for the sake of truth. That's number one. Number two, even more shocking, they're not debating a cosmic issue of when is the Messiah going to come, or which was created first, heaven or earth, or something inspiring. They're debating a very, very intricate, tiny point of law of leprosy, which is kind of gross, very physical, right? And that's what they're debating in heaven. And number three, what they're specifically debating is a case of uncertainty, of doubt, of safek. We don't know which one came first. What do you mean you don't know which one came first? You're in heaven. So those are three shocking, ironic, humorous things about the story, but the story is presented unironically. This is just what they were debating. And the Holy One, God, says the person is pure. But every other member of the Heavenly Academy says the person in a case of uncertainty is impure. We consider them impure. That's what's going on in heaven. Rabbi Bar Nachmani is sitting on a tree in trouble. He's in danger. And at the same time, this is what's going on in heaven. And in heaven, they say, who can decide this dispute? Who can arbitrate this dispute? Who can come to a final conclusion about this dispute? We need to decide it. We've been arguing for a long time. On earth, sometimes when people are arguing for a long time, we send a voice from heaven. They accepted in the first story, they rejected in the second story, but now it's reversed. Now we're in an argument in heaven. Who's going to decide the argument for us? Not a heavenly voice, an earthly human voice. We're going to get the expert to decide. The expert in this particular area of Jewish law is Rabbi Bar Nachmani. Rabbi Bar Nachmani should arbitrate, should decide the legal opinion, because he once said, I am the preeminent scholar in this area of leprosy, and also in the issues of tents, which is another area of the purity and impurity laws. So Rabbi Bar Nachmani said that. He's acknowledged as the greatest authority in this area. We're stuck. You know, it's God on one side, all the other members of the Heavenly Academy who are they, by the way? Are they the souls of the sages who have passed away? That's probably the implication, but we don't know for sure. Are they angels? Probably, let's say that they're the souls of the sages from previous generations who are now in heaven, but it's not exactly defined. Another shocking thing we should notice, God is on one side and all the other sages or whoever, members of the academy, are on the other side. Wouldn't you think that the law would be decided by God? So this might be an indication or a proof that this story knows about the other story that we just read. This story knows that Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Yoshua said, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. this story already takes into account that the Torah is not in heaven, and that therefore we need a human voice to decide, and also perhaps that therefore we don't decide the law based on God's opinion just because God is God. God has already given up that authority to human beings. So that's an indication that this story is conscious of the previous story. And because they need Rabbah, they sent a messenger from heaven to take his soul up to the heavenly academy. And this is a bittersweet tale because this is really the tale of the death of Rabbah bar Nachmani. They sent the angel of death to Rabbah, not as a punishment or anything negative, but because they needed him. They needed him in heaven. They needed his help. They're trapped in this dispute. They can't resolve it. He's the only one who can help. So they sent the angel of death, but the angel of death was unable to approach him. Why? Because Rabbah didn't stop learning Torah. And we have an old tradition and other legends that a person who is studying Torah constantly cannot die. So we have this famously about King David at the end of King David's life. Similarly, David asked God, please tell me, God, when I'm going to die. We have a verse in Psalms that says that says, Umidat yamai mahi. God, please tell me, how long will I live? And God says, I can't tell you that. It would take all the fun out of living if you knew that. But what I'll do, because you're asking nicely, is I'll tell you which day of the week you're going to die. And I'll tell you, you're going to die on the Sabbath. So David started, every Sabbath, he started learning Torah. And for the entire Sabbath, 25 hours, he would learn Torah constantly so that the angel of death couldn't take him. And according to the legend, the angel of death tried and couldn't take David's soul until the angel of death finally figured out that if he interrupts David's studies, he will succeed in taking David's soul. And so he went outside David's room, he made a big noise, David was startled, he interrupted his studies, and that's when the angel of death took King David, when King David was 70 years old, on a Shabbat, on a Sabbath, which was also the holiday of Shavuot. We have this tradition. As a footnote to this, by the way, the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman, says, we hear these legends that people in former days were able to defeat the angel of death through Torah study. But nowadays, we see many people who are studying Torah and they die in the middle of their Torah studies. So what's going on? So a very down-to-earth, realistic question. So Rabbi Nachman says, nowadays people don't really know how to study Torah with that level of intention needed to defeat the angel of death. But we have this idea in Jewish legend, and it appears here again. The angel of death couldn't approach Rabbah because he kept studying. But the same kind of thing happened. A wind blew, and Rabbah thought that it was an infantry battalion, that it was the police who were sent by the government. Because remember, he's being chased by the tax collector and the government. So he was afraid that that's the noise that he's hearing, that they're coming to get him. And he says, I'd rather die than be given over to the hands of the government, or they might torture me or whatever. And then the angel of death was able to take him. As he was dying, the last thing he said was to answer the dispute in heaven. And he said, pure, pure, tahor, tahor. It is pure, and a divine voice now. The same kind of divine voice we heard before, a voice from heaven emerged and said, happy are you, Rabbah bar Nachmani, your body is pure, your soul left your body with the word pure. And a note fell from heaven and landed miles away in the academy of Pumbedita, where Rabbah was the sage, the leader, and it said, Rabbah bar Nachmani was summoned to the heavenly academy. Which means that Rabbah has died, but it also means that Rabbah bar Nachmani was summoned to the heavenly academy because they needed him up there. So here we have a third model where not only are human beings rejecting the divine voice because the Torah belongs to us, but now we have the complete reversal of the first story. The first story, remember, 3 years of dispute between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. They couldn't decide. They need a divine voice. A divine voice comes down and tells them, ultimately, you're both right, but the law is like Beit Hillel, the school of Hillel. Great. Case closed. We have resolution, we have clarity, we know how to move forward. Then we have the stage a few generations later where Rabbi Joshua or Yeshua stands up and says the Torah is not in heaven. We don't listen to heavenly voices anymore. Great, human beings are now independent. Now in this third story, what are we? Are we independent? We're more than independent. Now we are the critical senior decisor, even in legal disputes that are taking place in heaven. So in the world of the rabbinic imagination, dispute and conflict take place in heaven and on earth. And our role is to decide which way to go, decide to resolve the disputes. But sometimes in heaven, they're stuck and they look to us. They look to us to decide the disputes, to resolve the disputes. And that's a big responsibility. And these three stories together give us a portrait of Jewish responsibility for resolving conflicts and clarifying disputes and controversies about legal matters, about ritual matters, perhaps we could say about other matters as well, political matters and so on. We have a responsibility. We're not going to get a voice from heaven come out and say, here's the answer. It's on us, it's our responsibility. The rabbis celebrated that fact, that we bear responsibility for the future of the world, and sometimes we bear responsibility even for the future of the heavenly realm. So I'll pause here for your questions and comments.
So I wrote down a few questions as we went along that people had asked, and then I'm going to unmute Howard Mirowitz, one of our local patrons, who had a very long paragraph, and it'll take me like a while to figure it out. So I figure Howard can ask the question himself. Norman wants to know, since you brought it up yourself, why does the Talmud start on a page 2, a bet and not an aleph?
There are many, many reasons given, but the simplest reason, and my favorite reason, is that it's teaching us that we can never really begin at the beginning. When we join the conversation, we're joining a conversation that has gone on for many generations. And there's a certain humility in that, knowing that people came before us. They asked questions that we are asking. They dealt with the issues that we're dealing with. There's a humility that comes with that, and there's also a reassurance that comes with that, that we're dealing with big questions in the world right now. We need to understand that it's not completely new. People have dealt with these kinds of issues before. I just had a meeting today of the Witness Institute, and we were talking about recent events in our country. And one of the members of this group is a professor of classics, and so he was bringing an example from Athens, 2,500 years ago, that is very, very similar to what we are experiencing today in many ways. And it's instructive, it's humbling, and it's also reassuring to know that we are not inventing this situation. We don't have to create new responses from scratch. We can look to the wisdom of the past. And that's why, one reason why the Talmud begins with the second page.
You know, on that note, Chuck, who's been participating, says that the story about the bed that I've heard, I mean, in the past, about the size of the bed, and they would either stretch you out in Sodom or chop off your legs. He said that's actually a story from Greek mythology, and that Procustus, is that his name? I don't know. And anyway, he said that story is either taken or is also replicated in other traditions.
Very nice connection. Yeah,
I share that with you. I thought that was interesting. Bob wanted to confirm that the reason we need 10 for a minyan is based on the first story, when Abraham argues down to 10, can't find 10 in Sodom. Is that the reason we have a minyan, or is it from a different source in our tradition?
The main reason that's given is from a different source, although this seems to correspond to that certainly. And so it seems to be a supporting source, but the main source that's given is from the spies in the desert, the spies who were sent to scope out the land of Israel. They're called an Edah, which is a community, and there were 10 of them. There were 10 of them, not including Joshua and Kalev, who were the two spies who returned a positive report. So it's very interesting that we actually learn the law, the archetype of minyan, of a quorum of 10 men traditionally for a prayer service. We actually learn it from an example of a community of 10 people who were really, really on the wrong path. So very, very interesting. You would expect that, we would learn it from somewhere more positive like this source, but we actually learn it from an example that's a negative example. But nonetheless, they are called an Eidah, they are called a quorum or a community. That's the primary source that's given for the concept of minyan.
Okay, great. The question that came up was, how often, are there any other stories in the Talmud of a voice coming down from heaven?
Yes.
Participate in discussion.
There are. And I should mention that the technical term that's given in the original story, the Hebrew or the Aramaic, is a bat kol, the daughter of a voice, literally. The daughter of a voice, which is one poetic way of saying an echo. It's always understood as a divine voice. It's translated often as divine voice, but it's literally a bat kol, the daughter of a voice, an echo. And it's not a direct voice, it's the daughter of voice, it's an echo. It's sort of secondary, it's one step removed. And if you ever want to search for the other places where this term appears to find some of the other stories, what you can do is go to Sefaria, the website Sefaria. Ari, maybe we can send it out again as a link. And there's a search bar. And you can search in English, or there's a Hebrew keyboard you can pull up and type in the letters in Hebrew if you're comfortable with that. And you can search for all the references and then filter to find any reference to a bat kol or divine voice, perhaps, in the Talmud. And you'll see some of the other stories. It appears infrequently, and the reason it's generally understood to be an echo or the daughter of a voice is that the voice itself was the voice of prophecy, which in the era that we are exploring today is now over. So the prophets had access to the voice. The rabbis don't have access to the voice anymore. They only have access to the daughter of the voice, which is the echo. And that's the closest they can come. So there are other stories like that. For the sake of time, I limited us to 3, but there are other stories. And there are other stories about wrestling and some degree of divine intervention in wrestling.
Yeah, so people have asked, we'll try to find some of those references and share it through Sefaria. And if you want to do your own search, we'll try to get you that. So I'm going to unmute Howard Mirowitz, let him ask his question for you. He wants to talk about differences between the second and third stories from his perspective and get your input on that.
Great.
Howard, if you're there, will you join us?
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to ask about to kind of respond with a question to your question about comparing the Conor Bachni case to the Sodom and Gomorrah, or to the
Howard, can you just speak up a little bit?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about your comparison of when you said how can we compare these two cases, the Achnai case versus the Hillel Shammai case. And it seems, when I think about the Achner case, Tanner Achnai case, it's like Marbury Madison to the U.S. Constitution, right? Marbury versus Madison was the case in 1803 that established that the Supreme Court could declare things unconstitutional, right? And so that kind of a decision is a kind of meta level thing, right? It's on a whole nother level than a normal court case, right? Because it's like there's a whole class of court cases that you can't even talk about until you decided whether the Marbury versus Madison case lets the Supreme Court talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
And this case in Hillel and Shammai is like one such example of a case like that. So you couldn't even have the discussion of the Hillel Shammai discussion on that level and say both of them are talking for, arguing for the sake of God, and only one of you is right, but both of you are, only one of them is the answer, but both of you are arguing, for the sake of God.
Right.
First, you have to establish that you can even have significant arguments of this type.
Right. It's a great parallel. There are two things that are different or striking about this through that lens. I think it's a wonderful comparison. It would be a great paper for someone to write, a great essay to compare those two cases. in constitutional law and history and Jewish law and history. But the two things that are different, or at least food for thought. Number one, there's no explicit meta-level conversation in the story of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right? No one is looking at that level of what are the norms of argument or of conflict, which, by the way, is one of the most useful things a person can do when they find themselves in a conflict, right? Let's say you get into an argument with somebody in real life or on social media, which happens a lot nowadays, right? So one of the best things that can happen before you get sucked into the argument further and you're responding on the level of the argument is you can take a step back and you can say, what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the norms that we want to agree to here? Or what's a covenant that we might come to about how to engage in conflict? So Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai in the first story are not doing that. They just accept that we listen to voices from heaven, and they seem to accept that because we come from a tradition that has a biblical, a very rich biblical tradition of prophecy. And even though we don't have prophecy, we can still access the echo of prophecy, but there's no explicit, conscious, intentional conversation around that. So that's a surprising thing. And the other thing is that in the second story, there's also no intentional discussion about the meta level. They don't say, well, we're going to talk about now, do we accept heavenly voices? Do we accept miracles as admissible evidence or not? I mean, that would be a fascinating legal conversation. You've got a clairvoyant who works with the police. There was a show like that, right? There was a TV show like that, or maybe several. Is that admissible evidence? You know, we didn't get a search warrant, but she saw the desk of the person, she saw the murder weapon in the drawer of the desk, you know, through ESP, and you know, is that admissible evidence? We can discuss that, we can debate that. But here, the rabbis are not debating that. They're stumbling into that conversation because one of the rabbis is really going off the rails. One of the rabbis is resorting to a set of tools that the other rabbis don't agree with, we haven't discussed. And that's why the story has a little hint of absurdity about it, or humor about it, because, you know, if we're having a conversation and someone starts communicating only in yodels on the Zoom, right? And that's how they're communicating a thought or a question. And as someone who's totally capable of having a conversation in words, but who chooses to communicate or an interpretive dance, you know, and we haven't talked about that. We haven't decided that's a way that we're going to have our conversation. So we all would wonder, like, what's going on, and why is this person going off the reservation? And, you know, and like finding a new way of communicating. And now that it's happening, we have to deal with it. That's what happened in the second story. Rabbi Eliezer was using a new way of communicating, using miracles or magic or something. And now, in response to that, very spontaneously, Rabbi Yoshua stands up and says, we don't pay attention to that stuff. And you're absolutely right. Once he says that, once Rabbi Yoshua says, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, the Torah belongs to us, the Torah doesn't belong to God anymore, so to speak, right? I mean, theologically, everything belongs to God, but it doesn't belong to God because God gave it to us. So that's now accepted as a rule for the future of every single debate in the Talmud going forward, and the post-Talmudic period, all the way to the modern period, even in you know, very traditional communities. So this actually came up in several moments when, if those of you who are participating in the Hasidic class, we have some examples of Hasidic rabbis who were mystical masters who sometimes would seem to be deciding the law based on their mystical knowledge, right? And there are examples of this. There are stories about this. And it turned out that they were right. They had some kind of preternatural abilities or clairvoyance. It was true, it was accurate, but it's actually inadmissible. It's not something that we accept as a methodology for determining the law or the policies of the Jewish community, because Rabbi Yoshua already said, the Torah is not in heaven. We don't use mystical powers to determine the law. We use logic, argumentation, precedent. That's how our tradition has grown and really been built over time. So it's a great parallel. Those two things are striking because the two things I mentioned are striking because they seem to be unintentional. They're backing into the conversation about what's the method here. And that is disturbing in a certain way, because we would like to think that the rabbis are always, that the great sages of the Talmud are always going to be intentional. They're going to plan in a very strategic way what the conversation is going to be, what the goals of the conversation are going to be. That's not the case here. Here they stumble into a situation, now they have to figure it out, and they figure it out, and it determines the future of all of Judaism.
Let's end with one last question, and that is, you said you were excited, you changed this whole lecture up in the last minute. What did you change and why?
That's a great question. So I was going to focus on Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai only. That was my intention for today's learning, because we're doing a series on tales of conflict, and so I wanted to go sort of biblical era, early rabbinic era, later rabbinic era, and then modern or Hasidic era as examples. But when I was thinking about it about an hour before we started, I thought about the story that we saw of the voice from heaven coming down to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And I started thinking about the relationship between the horizontal and the vertical, between interpersonal conflict and the idea that we have in Jewish tradition that we can argue with God. And what's the relationship between the two? And as I was thinking about that, suddenly I thought of the story, I remember the story of Rabbah Bar Nachmani, the last story that we saw. And I realized for the first time ever that it's the polar opposite, it's the reversal, it's the inverse of the first story. The first story is humans are arguing and debating, a voice from heaven comes down to resolve the problem. The Rabbah story is voices in heaven, people in heaven, God and the others in heaven are debating, and a voice from the earth comes up to reveal the law and to determine the law. I had never realized that before. It's perfectly symmetrical. I don't know if it's intentionally perfectly symmetrical, but it turns out that it's perfectly symmetrical, and there's something there. There was a thread I wanted to pull on. I became very curious about that. And along the way, as we were studying together, I discovered a few new things that I've never seen before, one of which is two things. One is that both stories are told by Shmuel, by the great sage Shmuel, who, by the way, was one of the most scientific of all the sages. He was a great astronomer, for example. He was a doctor, he was a medical doctor, whatever that means at the time, but he was involved with science and medical studies and astronomy. But he's telling me stories about arguments in heaven and so on. The second thing I noticed is that at the end of the Rabbah story, what happens as the punchline? A voice from heaven comes down. A voice from heaven comes down, just like in the first story. But now, rather than determining the law, rather than resolving a dispute, as in the first story, the voice from heaven is now basically saying, thank you. Thank you, Rabbah. Thank you, human being. Thank you, human mind, for helping us to resolve our conflict in heaven. So thank you all for joining me in that experiment.
I think it was great. I mean, many of us have probably heard the first two stories. I would say I've never heard the last one. So I should have taken a poll. How many of you heard all three stories? I mean, I'd be interested to know who's heard that last story, because it is certainly not one that I've come across. So thank you for sharing that and sharing your process. So it's good for people to know that obviously Ariel does not have canned programs. He just pulls out of a binder. He's thinking about them and changing them. It's one reason why I can't send out handouts before the program, because Ariel's working on them like up to the minute where he gets online. So it's pretty fresh material. So I hope you're enjoying it. But afterwards, I will try to share some of these handouts. I've been collecting them.
You didn't ask. You asked how many people knew these stories. How many of you have heard a voice from heaven? Don't raise your hand if you did. You can email me separately. We'll talk.
All right. We did a program on past. Does Judaism believe in
Reincarnation.
rebirth, and yeah, and about 60%, I think, said yes. So this crowd, we're in touch. We're in California. We're in touch with things in the East Coast. Like I don't know what Neil does out there and on the East Coast, but out here, people. I mean, it's beautiful outside. People are under the trees right now doing stuff. You never know. So people, I know people want to know if you're in Orange County and you're between the age of 18 and 65 and you want to know about this trial going on right now, you have to email me separately, and I'll get it to you after the program this afternoon. I'm going to share it with some people. They're taking. They need people right now for the Novavax thing. Okay, so with that, we'll see you on Sunday, Ariel. You're going to keep yourself safe, and we part 2 of Elie Wiesel, I believe, correct?
That's right.
We left them at the year 1970. I think that's what you said.
We're moving forward in time. We're also going to focus in on some of the key themes and preoccupations and obsessions of Professor Wiesel throughout his life, throughout his writing career and teaching career and work as an activist.
Great. Okay, everybody. So with that, that's it. Have a nice, I wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. For ours, have a nice Shabbos and relax, be safe. You have a lot to think about. I'll try to send you some handouts over Shabbat. You can print them out and show people that third story. Challenge your rabbi. See if your rabbi has heard about this story, the final story. I'd be interested to know how many of you. Maybe we'll do a poll next time. This is the end of, I guess, program number 7. Program number 8 is coming up, and good to see everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbos. Bye.